Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, I don't want to go this so formally. To start again, good evening, my dear students, and good morning, Alessandro, because I think in Australia now it's tomorrow morning, right?
It is.
I hope you all are well and safe in these difficult times we are going through, and people are still coming in. And we are trying to still learning and still in touch besides the pandemic. This is the reason why we are starting now our weekly event titled Dialogues on Development, Company and Society. It's an event organized by University of Marília, but it's absolutely open to all the law community. So welcome everybody. I've seen here people from different states of Brazil. Say hello to people to Mato Grosso do Sul, people from Acre, people from Minas Gerais, people from Mato Grosso, people from Paraná, and people from São Paulo, of course. And today, it's a pleasure to have with us Professor Alessandro Pelizzon. He's professor in Southern Cross University in Australia, and his lecture will be about ecological jurisprudence. The title is Neither Natural nor Posited, The Journey Toward an Ecological Jurisprudence. And the subject is extremely current and is in line with what we already work in the University of Marília in my classes. I met Professor Alessandro in New York 1 year ago because of the United Nations project called Harmony with Nature. My students already know what it is, but all of you can get more information on this on the internet. It's a very interesting project, a little different from sustainability or sustainable development. We have an approach more biocentric, something like this. And me and Alessandro will stay in touch. We wrote an article together. It is published in Argumentum, Journal of Law. It was published a few days ago. It makes me very proud. Thank you for this, Alessandro. In fact, I am a great admirer of Professor Alessandro's work. So I made that invitation and he gently accepted. He's lucky us. He's here now. Professor Alessandro is now dedicating himself to writing his new book, which will certainly be a success. But even so, he accepted to be here, talking to Brazilian public, talking to our students, and it increases our gratitude. Thank you again, Alessandro. Sometimes I think I will say thank you forever. I would like to mention the presence of Professor Jonathan Vita here. He's the coordinator of the master's degree and the doctorate in law at University of Marília. And Professor Jonathan will discuss the topic with us because it should be a dialogue. So finally, I wish everyone a great experience. I think it's a very important moment to our university because all the need of internationalization. And Professor Alessandro, feel free to start your lecture when you want. We look forward to hear you. I'm sure we all have lots of things to learn from you. And thank you once again. You can start when you want.
Well, thank you, Mariana. Thank you very much for this lovely introduction, wonderful invitation, and fantastic opportunity. As Mariana said, it is already your future here, and you are in my past, in that it is 7 a.m. here in Australia. And as Professor Vita said, there are no fake news here either. You can see that I'm actually having to communicate and connect from my own home office, which also means that if at some point you hear the coffee machine going, that's my partner actually making the coffee. So I apologize in advance for that. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be here. And before I begin, I really hope that you're all safe, both physically and mentally in these trying times. I think the news that I was talking to Mariana a few days ago, the news that I can hear and I see coming from Brazil are somewhat problematic and distressing. So I really hope that you're all in a safe space. As my name suggests, I'm not originally from Australia. I was born, raised, and schooled in Italy, which means that, like you, like all Latinos, I tend to speak extremely fast, which may be a problem if I speak this fast in English. And so I've promised Mariana that I'm making a huge effort in slowing down my speech. However, if that is were not to be enough, please feel free to interrupt me at any point throughout the presentation so that I can actually repeat or explain the point that I was making at any point. It is, I have to say, a huge challenge to try and speak slowly. It's not in our blood. We're Latinos. We speak quickly. We speak with our hands. But that notwithstanding, I will try. Before I introduce myself, notwithstanding the beautiful introduction that Mariana already gave, I want to begin in the way in which here in Australia, we begin all gatherings by acknowledging the country that we inhabit in today. And country is an Aboriginal concept, or it's a concept derived from the colonial era and from the Aboriginal encounter. And it represents not just a geopolitical entity. For the Aboriginal people of Australia, country is more than a simple possession of territory. Country is, in the words of Deborah Rose, the nexus of identity and being. Or in the words of my Aboriginal mentors, country is the total sum of all the beings and phenomena with which we share this particular space today. But more than that, country is the total sum of all the relationships and interactions with and among these beings and phenomena. And even further, country is the total sum of the stories within which these interactions are contained and construed. And so with this in mind, I would like to pay my respect to the owners and the custodians of these stories, the elders, the ones who were, the ones who are, and the ones who are yet to be. And so I would like to invite you to spend a couple of seconds to pay attention to the networks of relationships, the beings, the phenomena, the stories, and the custodians of those stories within which you are enmeshed in your own local country. But as Annie Barbara Nicholson always says, country is not just a space in a place or a location in space. It's also a location in time. And so country represents the diachronical and synchronical relationship that we are having in this moment. And so with this in mind, I actually sincerely want to pay my respect to all of you. I can see that there are over 60 people here, all of you for being here today. And so I hope I will be able to make this time worthwhile and interesting. As Mariana said, I have been involved in the emerging field of what I call an ecological jurisprudence, and I will explain that later, for well over 10 years now, since its inception. I was one of the original founders of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature over 10 years ago in Ecuador, when there were 35 of us coming up with this idea. And I've always focused my attention primarily on the intersection between different legal ontologies, different legal systems, not just civil and common law, but well beyond that. I've embraced legal orders that are often defined as chthonic or original or traditional or indigenous legal orders. And I've looked at the points of intersection of these legal orders and the emergence of rights of nature legislation and ideals throughout the world. So without any further ado, I will now start the presentation. So after this, I will only see the slides. But please, if you do need me to slow down or clarify anything, please interrupt me at any point. I'm sure that there will be time for questions later, but in the meantime, please interrupt me at any point if needs be. So I will start this. Now tell me, are you able to see the slides? Please let me know because I can't see anyone at the moment.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So in 1972, Professor Christopher Stone of the University of Southern California concluded one of his property law lectures with what was then, and still is today, a very provocative question. Should trees have standing, he asked. The question obviously provoked quite a number of quiet laughter on the part of the students who were just marching out of the lecture. But the question was far from sarcastic. It had been prompted by the proposed development in the southern Sierra Mountains of California of a massive resort by a subsidiary of Walt Disney Company. A development which would have cleared and destroyed a large swath of an old-growth forest. And the Sierra Club, the long-standing protector of the Sierra Mountains, launched an action to try and stop the development. However, the Supreme Court of the United States argued that since the Sierra Club was not directly damaged by the proposed development, it did not have standing. But Professor Stone argued or counter-argued, something was indeed being destroyed, something was indeed being damaged, that is, the old-growth forest. And if standing was the necessary premise for that to be stopped, then maybe trees or the forest ought to have been granted standing. Well, while at the beginning, at the onset, laughter was the answer to this question, Professor Stone could have scarcely have predicted how this suggestion would have affected the dominant legal paradigm in the decades to come. In his own words, this suggestion, quote, "This suggestion has since assumed a modest but apparently enduring place in contemporary environmental law and ethics, quite out of proportion to its actual impact on the courts," end of quote. Well, in reality, we'll see that the impact on the courts and on legal systems worldwide is far greater than what Professor Stone lamented over 10 years ago. But one thing that we can ask is, what is it in our modern legal consciousness that makes this damage or those damages legally invisible, or at least legally irrelevant? What is it in our modern consciousness, or our modern collective and global consciousness, that enables us collectively to avoid seeing the disastrous results of our collective way of life? Perhaps this invisibility of those damages comes, at least in part, for a particular understanding of nature or matter itself. A way of, or worldview that has been defined by mathematical cosmologist Brian Swimme and comparative metaphysicians Mary Evelyn Tucker as deterministic materialism, which was, quote, "a worldview that emerged in the late 16th century amidst intense debates of the natural philosophy. It had three tenets: that all things in the universe are composed of tiny particles of matter, that these particles are purely material without any degree of subjectivity, and that these particles move according to fixed mathematical laws. But where does this idea come from? Where can we find or trace the origin of this particular worldview? Well, certainly, if we're looking at the way in which nature has been conceived, it may be that the modern idea of nature has very profound and deep roots in our ancient past. Some connected to the emergence of the great cultural revolution of 70 to 35,000 years ago, which culminated in the agricultural explosion of 10,000 years ago. Colin Tudge suggests that natural habitats, with the transition from hunting gathering to fledgling farmers and villages, were no longer wild places in which to hunt and gather food and occasionally burn over with ground fires, but rather became land to be cleared for agriculture. And this particular conception of wild land, of nature as something to be replaced, has become somewhat of a mental fixation of most of the world's population today. But if we want to look at the philosophical roots of this particular worldview, then we can look at the oldest philosophical texts that we have available, that is, the Greek texts. And for the Greek philosophers, particularly the pre-Socratic philosophers, nature, or better, the understanding of matter, was the primary concern. The definition of nature was concerned for them to the definition of matter. That's why I'm using the two terms somewhat interchangeably here. They asked, is there a single kind of matter? Is matter comprised of a single substance that has multiple permutations? Or are there multiple kinds of matter? Is nature a single whole or a collection of separate entities, in other words? Is it a continuous substance capable of expressing multiple forms, or a number of discrete, unchanging constituents? Parmenides, very famously, was concerned with the pursuit of the nature of being, and created the category of being and the opposite category of not being, the void. And it is within this, the category of the void, that Democritus conceived of nature as consisting of discrete, separate, and ultimately independent particles, units that he called atoms, floating in a void of nothingness. Democritus' view, enriched by Plato, by Aristotle, by Roman pragmatism, and ultimately by Christian theology, was further advanced at the birth of modern science and the modern scientific discourse by Descartes' syllogism. Descartes' famous syllogism, often translated in English, I think, therefore I am, was transformed into an ontological premise. In other words, the world is comprised of three categories of being: the res divina, the nature of God; the res extensa; and res cogitans. Res cogitans, the mind, is separate from matter, res extensa. And the mind is only possessed of by humans. So this mind-matter divide that Descartes, this dualism that Descartes introduced, is at the very basis of modern science, as we all know. And that also speaks of human exceptionalism. Humans, because they possess a mind, are exceptional among the universe, among the whole of existence. Everything else can be seen and can be explored, studied, inquired in a mechanistic way. And so the whole of nature, far from being a collection of living beings, became and turned into a collection of clockwork mechanisms. Swim and Tucker write that for centuries, scientists have attempted to explain the universe by means of physical laws expressed in mathematical equations. The universe was thought to consist of mechanisms within mechanisms. And so for Alessandro Volta, for example, a frog was nothing more than a tool, an object to be dismantled at will to find the nature of electricity. So this human exceptionalism was combined with a growing sense of anthropocentrism. That is the idea that humans are central, superior, and somewhat separate from the rest of the universe. And that transformed nature from something that is and that we are part of as humans to something to tame, something to conquer, something to shape for human desires, for human needs. And so a natural landscape lost any and all value in and of itself, and only became, and still is, valuable if it can be developed, if it can be changed and morphed for some human need or purpose. A prime or pristine land has no value in and of itself, unless that value is attributed for conservative reasons, conservation reasons. But other than that, it has no value in and of itself unless it is developed. Suman Tucker again suggests that modern industrial humans did not seek to commune with nature. Rather, they sought to transform the world. Using new technological powers, they would create a better world, one with greater quantities of food, more efficient transportation, and faster communication. Using their new machines, they would eliminate poverty, hunger, and sickness. Maybe the intention of many were, at least at times, that noble. The results, however, are far from that noble. We know that today. We know the degree of biodiversity loss, of environmental degradation, of resource consumption, of climate change or anthropogenic climate change, anthropogenic induced climate change. We know all of that. And so the consequences that we can see today are dire. Dynamized by their technology and their dreams of material progress, modern humans transformed the planet into a bundle of resources. Nature became nothing more than a bundle of resources. Humans produced food in quantities never seen in history, and consequently, populations exploded. And therefore, feeding and housing this many humans led to the depletion of the oceans, the degradation of the forest, the loss of the topsoil. The paradox, possible paradox, of unintended consequences is now staring us in our faces. It is now becoming evident. The oceans, the rivers, the atmosphere, and the soil all have been severely degraded by our actions. And yet, we have crossed over into an Earth whose very atmosphere and biosphere are being shaped by human decisions. We live on a planet today where not biology, but rather symbolic consciousness is the determining factor for evolution. Cultural selection has overwhelmed natural selection. That is, the survival of species and entire ecosystems now depends primarily on human activities. And so we as a collective collection of humans are faced with a challenge that no previous human has ever contemplated. How are we to make decisions that will benefit an entire planet for the next several millennia? However, it's also important to remember that worldviews alone did not transform the world that we see, but rather these ontological possibilities that were awarded by Cartesian dualism, matched with Lockean individualism, and shaped a suite of legal and normative structures that permitted the transformation that we see every day. One of my colleagues, Associate Professor Nicole Graham from the University of Sydney, coined a very convincing term a few years ago to describe this interplay between worldviews and legal structures. And she suggests that everything that we see is a lawscape, It's not a landscape, but rather a lawscape. Everything that we see today, just by virtue of the sheer power of human ingenuity, human numbers, and human technology, is the result of what law permits nature to be. When we see a landscape, it's not a landscape, it's a lawscape. It's something that law, if not creates, shapes to a very large extent. And so every place that we inhabit is a lawscape. If our environment is thus shaped by not only our power, but the legal power that surrounds us, and if our environment is shaped by what surrounds us as matter, and what surrounds us is nothing but matter, then what are the implications for legal landscapes and legal worldviews? Well, most importantly, nature becomes a collection of objects. If nature is nothing more than a bundle of resources, then it belongs to the normative category of objects, not of subjects. And in particular, nature becomes, or this bundle of resources becomes an object or a series of objects of rights. And even more in particular, they become a bundle of objects of property rights. And so if nature is just an object of rights, and the subject of these rights have absolute power over that, which is the object of these rights, then the images that were seen by Professor Stone were indeed legally irrelevant, or possibly even legally invisible. However, in 1962, Rachel Carson had already written that the Earth's vegetation is part of a web of life in which there are intimate and essential relations between plants and the Earth, between plants and other plants, between plants. Sometimes we have no choice but to disturb these relationships, but we should do so thoughtfully, with full awareness that what we may do may have consequences remote in time and place. And so the interconnectedness between human affairs and the affairs of the biosphere, and the interdependence between the state of the biosphere and the legal structures that regulate human interactions with it, require that we rethink both our ontological landscapes and our normative lawscapes. And so what began as a self-described thought experiment in the halls of US legal academia in the early 1970s has certainly become, as we will see shortly, a lived reality in a number of jurisdictions today, and much more than a theoretical possibility for many activists and scholars alike. Stone asked at that time in 1972, what would a radically different, law-driven consciousness look like? How would such a posture in law affect a community's view of itself? Well, the answer to his question was fully articulated for the first time by eco-theologian and self-described Earth scholar Thomas Berry, who called for, quote, a jurisprudence that would provide for the legal rights of geological and biological, as well as human components of the Earth community, end of quote. Berry called this an Earth jurisprudence. Together with a number of colleagues, I've proposed 8 years ago to move beyond the planetary boundaries contained in the term Earth by adopting the term ecological jurisprudence, the term that encompasses Earth jurisprudence as a theory, but more than that, and a term that tries to speak to the theoretical underpinnings of these novel ways of considering the normative relationship between humanity and the environment. However, Berry's argument in the early 2000s was particularly important because, far from being anthropocentric, his suggestion was not only biocentric, but effectively ecocentric. It echoed the teaching or the writings of deep ecologists, such as Arne Naess. Deep ecology was an environmental philosophy that had argued for decades that nature has intrinsic value in and of itself, irrespective of any utility to humans that it may possess. Thomas Berry argued that if humans are part of an interconnected and interdependent system of beings and phenomena, then the well-being of each member of the system is connected to and dependent from the well-being of the system as a whole. And therefore, the safeguarding of the well-being of the system as a whole is crucial and effectively more important than the safeguarding of each individual member of the system itself, including humans. So in other words, this ecocentric perspective is preferable in long-term ecological terms to an anthropocentric one. And consequently, our collective legal and governance systems should be developed in accordance with such perspective. Cormac Cullinan, author of Wild Law, probably the most seminal book in the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence in 2002, described it as such, quote, a philosophy of law and human governance that is based on the idea that humans are only one part of a wider community of beings, and that the welfare of each member of the community is dependent on the welfare of the earth as a whole. From this perspective, human societies will only be viable and flourish if they regulate themselves as part of this wider earth community and do so in a way that is consistent with the fundamental principles that govern how the universe functions. End of quote, what he called the great jurisprudence. So, on the one hand, Earth jurisprudence articulates in legal theoretical terms the application of evolutionary theory to legal and social organization. That is the insight that human societies are exposed to the process of natural selection in relation to issues of long-term environmental sustainability, just as single individual organisms are in relation to individual survival. And Earth jurisprudence advances the idea further by suggesting that human societies determine, or at least influence to a significant degree, their own path to sustainability or lack thereof. And they do so through a specific set of legal structures that implement and normativize their own cultural worldviews. Well, the main and most important consequence for such a proposal was casting nature not anymore as an object of and or with rights, but rather as a subject of and or with rights. The consequences were and are far from theoretical. The momentous change began in 2006 with the work of the Community and Environmental Legal Defense Fund in the US, whereby in the Tamako Borough in Pennsylvania, the local environment was inscribed as having rights within a local ordinance. Since then, more than 180 local ordinances such as this one have been drafted across the United States with some controversy, but nonetheless with a clear demonstration of the appeal, the legal and normative appeal that such an idea has had to many communities. Now, local ordinances are a unique lawmaking power that only belongs to, it is only found, as far as I know, in the United States. But from this original or initial original movements, the threshold that sees the passage of an ecological jurisprudence from being a theory, particularly the rights of nature movement, from being a theoretical movement to being a practical and an enshrined movement, is the passing of the Monte Cristi Constitution in Ecuador in 2008. One that, in 3 distinct constitutional provisions, recognizes nature, or Pachamama, as a legal subject of rights. 2 years thereafter, following the failure of the Copenhagen discussion, then Bolivian President Evo Morales, an Aymara man himself, called for a World Conference of Peoples on Climate Change and Mother Earth, the result of which was the drafting by more than 35,000 people of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. And what is particularly interesting of this document is the language being used, a language that transcends the somewhat objective and neutral definition of nature in scientific terms as nature, but rather in very subjective and interconnected terms as Mother Earth, which is here a translation of the Andean concept of Pachamama, which is somewhat approximately translated as Mother Earth. It's, I believe, as you know probably better than me, it's a far more complex concept than simply a maternal and an earthly concept. But nonetheless, it is a significant translation. At the end of the same year, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature was established in Ecuador by a congregation and a collection of individuals and institutions from all over the planet. Bolivia passed in 2010 the law of the rights of Mother Earth. And I will discuss that in a second in terms of the difference in their approach, in the Bolivian approach to the rights of nature movement. A year later, in Ecuador, the first successful rights of nature case was litigated, the Vilcabamba River case, whereby the municipal court of Loja received an injunction to restore part of the damaged riverbed that had been caused by the proposed development of a road, which, according to the court, infringed the rights, the fundamental and the constitutionally enshrined rights of the river to flow unimpeded. In 2012, Bolivia passed the framework law of Mother Earth and integral development for living well. The first ethics tribunal, which is, if you want to, a popular initiative to try and popularize the working or the implication of the emergence of a rights of nature framework, was established. In the same year, the Te Urewara legislation was passed in New Zealand, which recognized the forest as an independent entity. The UN Harmony with Nature program began in earnest at that time. That began a couple of years earlier. A year later, or 2 years later, the UK Green Party endorsed rights of nature initiatives to be followed and pursued if possible, and a host of European Union initiatives followed suit. In 2017, the Whanganui or Wanganui River legislation was passed, the Te Awa Act in New Zealand, which recognizes the Wanganui River as a legal person. That was the first time that naturally the consequences of rights of nature movements are the emergence or the necessary emergence and identification of a subject, but it's the first time that such an event occurred. This inspired the Ganges and Yamuna cases in India by the High Court of Uttarakhand and the Atrato River case by the Constitutional Court of Colombia in 2017. The Yarra Protection or Wilipingin Birrang Marang Act in Australia was passed in 2017, which recognizes the river as a living and indivisible whole. In Bolivia, the Amazon case was litigated by the Supreme Court of Colombia in 2018, and Colombia has since become a lighthouse or a focal point for the emergence of personhood or natural personhood in courts and particularly in judicial initiatives. These are just some of the most striking examples, just to show how rich and multi-jurisdictional the emergence of this rights of nature movement has been over a very short period of time, little over 10 years. And I focused in particular on the emergence of rights of nature. But we can see that the terms used are multiple. people speak of rights of nature, earth jurisprudence, wild law, earth law or earth laws, ecological law and governance, or as I said, ecological jurisprudence. And the institutional emergence of an ecological jurisprudence is thus undeniable. But it is probably even more significant for the theoretical possibilities it entails. Because we can see three phases here. There's an initial phase where the movement focused on casting nature as a subject of and with rights. That's for the first 6 to 10 years of the movement. Then that shifted to the articulation of personhood for nature. Obviously, if nature has rights, then it must be identified as a subject, but not just as a collective whole, but also in its instantiations. And so personhood became relevant. But personhood carried with it, as I'll show you in a second, a number of problems. And so the new phase is one that tries to transcend the pre-existing categories of personhood by looking at new ways of casting nature as a constructed person, as a legal person, as I will describe in a second. However, it's also important to remember that nature and rights are contested concepts with negotiable meanings. And so scholars should be fully aware that the yet largely indeterminate terrain occupied by the theory and practice of ecological jurisprudence may be already heavily inscribed by humanist precepts of what rights and nature, for example, might consist of. That notwithstanding, it's clear that the proposal is replete with theoretical possibilities. So let's look at the various elements. Rights. Rights have been articulated by the movement either as rights of nature or rights to nature. Rights as being intrinsic to nature itself, or rights as being granted to nature. Although there is some degree of confusion within the movement, rights have generically been used as strategic tools. In that Hefeldian dualism, they are used to draw up the Hefeldian correlative, the duties. And it is in this sense that if rights are used for nature to draw the duties the humans have toward nature, that's the way in which Bolivia has approached its rights of nature legislation. Rather than focusing on the rights of nature, they focus on the collective responsibilities of humans toward nature. And they emphasize very strongly this sense of collective responsibility, not in a bounded sense, but far from that, in a very joyful manner, as if responsibilities are a way of empowering humans to engage with nature as a whole. Another way of engaging with rights has been to focus on the absolute correlative of the duties. So the movement, for example, to inscribe ecocide within the international legal framework is one that very strongly speaks to this attempt to focus on human duties. But nature is also somewhat problematic. What is nature? Is a car natural? Many would say no, because its components do not exist without human intervention. And furthermore, they are only combined together by human ingenuity and enterprise. But the same is true of a modern fruit salad. Strawberries do not exist, at least in that form, without the intervention of monks throughout Europe for over 2,000 years. And a fruit salad doesn't exist without human ingenuity and intervention. In Australia, we have this very invasive species of toads called cane toads that have been able to wipe out the local population of frogs. And they are seen as a pest. An invasive species has aggressively colonized the environmental niches previously occupied by similar or parallel animals and have wiped them out. But that is also true of one of the iconic animals of the Australian landscape, the dingo, which wiped away the marsupial predators roughly 5,000 years ago. And Peter Singer, the Australian ethicist, as many of you know, argues that rights must be extended to animals because animals are sentient. That is, they are capable of feeling pain. And somewhat jokingly, at one point he said that sentience ends somewhere between a prawn and a mussel. A prawn being sentient and a mussel not. However, modern research or extensive research has shown that vegetables display all the markers of sentience that animals do. And so does that mean that we should speak of the rights of carrots then, just as much as we speak of the rights of a dolphin? And isn't sentience, after all, nothing more than moving and pre-existing signpost, just as Descartes had done? Isn't this just a shift from human exceptionalism in anthropocentrism to zoocentrism? White Jr. Once asked, do people have ethical obligations toward rocks? To almost all Americans, he wrote, still saturated with ideas historically dominant in Christianity, the question makes no sense at all. And yet, as we can see from the recognition of rivers as legal persons, the concept does make sense and legal sense in many jurisdictions. Furthermore, as I said, what does it mean to speak of legal personhood? One of the problems that emerged with the definition of rivers as legal persons was that we have generally inherited from the Roman legal tradition two categories of personhood. They're very clear to civil law scholars, far more than they are to common law scholars. We have natural persons, that is all human beings, and artificial persons, all constructs that human beings have recognized as being granted legal personhood. Both categories are called legal persons, in that even natural persons are a legal category after all. And all legal persons have rights and responsibilities. And the High Court of Tarakan was asked, well, what happens if a river floods? Is the river then responsible toward the humans and the communities that have been flooded? Obviously, this is a paradoxical and provocative question, but in a legal sense, it is a relevant question. That also leads to the issue of representation. How is it possible to construe legal obligations toward nature? Is it ever possible to be truly ecocentric, as some deep ecologists suggest? Is it possible, as Aldo Leopold wrote, to ever think like a mountain? Is it ever possible to know what nature wants? And that leads to agency. Who speaks on behalf of nature? Everyone, as in the case of the Constitution, the Ecuadorian Constitution, or selected individuals, as in the case of the Atrato River, with the creation of the Guardianes del Atrato, or of the Wanganui River, by two representatives, one from the nominated by the Crown, and one coming from the Iwi, the traditional tribe that lives in direct connection with the river itself. What happens when we have to balance competing rights? What happens when the rights of a river and the rights of a mountain, such as Mount Taranaki and Wanganui, for example, clash? Are we to intervene as humans in this clash of rights that we have construed within our lawscapes? Now, far from being daunting, these ideas have invited a plethora of interdisciplinary reflections. For example, Jane Bennett, in her quest for a political ecology of things, set herself the task of challenging the binary oppositions of life and matter, human and animal, organic and inorganic, and of developing a way of thinking about political matters that can, quote, better account for the contribution of non-human actants, end of quote, with a view to finding a way to think and see more ecologically. Levi Bryant, in The Democracy of Objects, spearheaded the object-oriented ontology, a movement that sees the entirety of the universe comprised not of subjects, but exclusively of objects, with the consequences that subjects are only a variant of objects. Bruno Latour, for example, asserts that ideas of nature are historically situated constructions of human consciousness. And thus, in rejecting this basic distinction between nature and culture, he claims that the development of modern society has rested on a collective self-delusion, and that the process of setting the natural world against culture as either a chaotic force that needs to be controlled or as Mother Nature in harmonious balance is unique to the Western philosophical tradition. So it is clear that this invitation to an ecological jurisprudence represents a novel and yet timeless theoretical terrain in which different legal ontologies can reimagine the interaction between humans and the great non-human other, with and within which we all share our very existence. And so in so doing this, the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence represents a way to transcend the classical natural law legal positivism divide. African lawyer Cormac Callinan in Wild Law wrote that Earth is our primary teacher as well as the primary lawgiver that gives birth to what he calls the great jurisprudence. So clearly that suggests that there are limits to human arbitrariness, and thus impeding somehow the possibility of unimpeded legal positivism, completely arbitrary legal positivism in a Kelsenian sense. Maybe that could be still legal positivism viewed from an evolutionary perspective, in that the legal systems that do not guarantee a sustainable relationship with the environment simply disappear. But that may also translate as a simple or a novel version of a classical natural law argument, which is not really satisfactory, of course, because natural law, as we know, obscures the operation of power in society. And so the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence is better represented as a post-positivist legal theory, a post-postmodern legal theory, one that engages with the great other, one that takes back the referent, the Saussurean referent, which is all, for Saussure and for postmodernity, has always been outside the system of cognition. It takes it back into the system of cognition. But also, and I want to conclude with this final reflection, the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence represents a multi-jurisdictional and multicultural terrain, because the presence of indigenous voices has been in the movement, has been crucial and central from the very onset. The Ecuadorian Constitution of Montecristi came to be because of the Pachakutik plurinational movement, an indigenous and indigenous-led movement in Ecuador. Thomas Berry acknowledged this in his own writing over 20 years ago. He wrote, quote, "One of the most striking things about indigenous peoples is that traditionally they live in conscious awareness of the stars in the heavens, the topography of the region, the dawn and sunset, the phases of the moon and the seasonal sequence. They live in a world of subjects, that is, in a world of inner expression shared by every mode of being, not a world of objects. Nothing is without identity, without dignity, without inner spontaneity. Everything has its sacred dimension, which must not be violated." This is very clear because, for example, for the Bunun people of central Taiwan, there is no single word to translate the word nature. Rather, they use a combination of two terms, asang and taki. Asang means all that is, the worldview that we inhabit. And taki represents the way in which we have to move within that worldview. But literally, taki means two things. It means, firstly, home, because they argue nature is the place that we live in. My nature is the place that I inhabit. But also, taki has a second meaning, and that's excrement, because our home is where we pollute, is where we poo, effectively. And so we have the responsibility of looking after the place that we live in. When I asked in one of my interviews during my doctoral research here in Australia, Uncle Dutch Kennedy, just south of Sydney, what does it mean to be an Aboriginal person? He said, this is my nature. And he said, when I say this, people think I refer to my inner self. This is who I am. This is my nature internally. And that's true. But nature is also everything that you see around you. It's these birds that come to feed here at this particular time of the year. It's the tides that come up and down from the sea every day. It is the berries that flourish in this particular season. And the interplay between my inner nature and my outer nature, which is being culturally construed for me, is what means for me to be an Aboriginal person. This idea, this sense of identity with Earth, with country, as I said at the beginning, where this individual identity and the country of belonging are one and the same, are fully realized in what Wade Davis defines as sacred geography. The Hawaiian people, for example, define one's identity by saying, "I'e Hawaii," I am Hawaii. I eat of this land and this land eats of me. As Wade Davis wrote, and many of you may be familiar, for the people of the Anaconda of the northeastern Amazonian basin, for example, rivers are not simply a way of transport and communication. Rather, they are the very veins of the earth, the paths along which the ancestors travel at the beginning of time. And at the same time, sacred sites are not memorial or symbols of distant mythic events. Rather, they are living places that eternally inform the present. Equally, for Australian Aboriginal people, the entire natural world is saturated with meaning and with cosmological significance. Every rock, every waterfall embodies a story, and everything is more than it appears, because the visible world is only one level of perception. And so every plant, every animal, every rock is a distinct physical representation of the same spiritual essence that connects uninterrupted all beings, thus making the distinction between humans and the rest of nature utterly void of meaning. To quote Swim and Tucker, they wrote that as humans, quote, every place we went, we became that place. That is the brilliant power provided by symbolic consciousness. With their cultural inventions, humans could adapt to new environments much more quickly than would be the case if they had to rely solely upon genetic changes. That's why the humans who decided to follow the reindeer rapidly became the reindeer people. They walked the same pathways as the reindeer. They ate some of the same foods. And at night, in their feasts and their dancing, they celebrated the thrill of being the reindeer people. Other humans aligned themselves with the whales and became the whale people. Some identified with the birds and began wearing feathers and greeting each dawn with song. The highest fulfillment became the act of joining with the birds' celebration. These early humans did not just journey through Earth's walls. The spirits of each world captivated their imaginations as they revisioned their lives in terms of that place. They absorbed every color and sound into their life and soul, end of quote. So we can see that the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence represents the terrain for the first interaction between very distinct legal orders. As Cormac Cullinan said once, we always look for a common ground. And yet, if we think about it, the common ground that we look for is always here. It's always beneath our feet. It's etymologically our common ground. And so an ecological jurisprudence truly represents an act of intercultural and internormative comparison without any precedents, because we do have a term of reference or a term of comparison which was previously absent. However, it's also important to remember that Indigenous cultures today live in a condition of asymmetry of power. And so the power differential exerts in more indirect colonial impositions. Stephen Luke, for example, coined the term environmentality to articulate the claim that, quote, most environmentalist movements now operate as a basic manifestation of governmentality, end of quote, in a Foucauldian sense. In other words, environmental subjects, be it human and non-human, are construed in that discourse. And so it is the great value of an ecological jurisprudence that it invites us collectively to think that issues of social justice and of environmental sustainability, of ontological inquiry and normative organization are not separate and separable, but rather form part of an intellectual and existential continuum that is shared by all human actors on the planet. And so I would like to conclude with the beautiful words of Wade Davis with which he begins his book, The Wayfinders. He writes, "One of the intense pleasures of travel is the opportunity to live amongst peoples who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel their past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. Just to know that in the Amazon, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way, that myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, that the Buddhists of Tibet still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology. The idea that the social world in which we live does not exist in some absolute sense, but rather is simply one model of reality, the consequence of one set of intellectual and spiritual choices that our particular cultural lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. All these people teach us that there are other options, other possibilities, other ways of thinking and interacting with the earth. This is an idea that can only fill us with hope." Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro, for your excellent lecture. I would like to make some questions for you. I made some notes. These are questions that I have studied a lot, but it's not so easy, as you know. And maybe you can help me with these points, if you don't mind. Okay?
Certainly. I don't know that I can help, but I'm so intrigued by the dialogue. So I'm not sure that I will be much help, but I really welcome this possibility of discussing.
Okay. So let's go. My first point is it's common to associate the rights of nature only with the Andean culture. But what about other cultures like African and Hinduism? That seems forgotten sometimes. I don't know if you mean what I'm saying. It's only about the idea of Pachamama, or in fact, we have similar ideas in other places of the world. And sometimes I feel some sad because the African ideas seems forgotten. And the second point is, what do you think about the possibility of having a universal declaration on the rights of nature? Do you believe that this can become reality due to political difficulties? This is a thing that I am worried about because of this political situation, including in Brazil. Another point is...
Sorry, then I had to make notes because I thought I was going to answer one. Okay. So let me make notes for the three of them. Yes. Yeah.
Do you mean what I'm worried about? The Africa idea seems so similar to Andean culture, but Africa seems every time forgotten.
Yeah.
It's worrying me. And the situation about a universal declaration, because you know all the difference between civil law and common law. We discuss about it in our article, and In Brazil, the situation is a little different, and I think it will be very important to Brazil to have this universal declaration. But I don't know, because there's a lot of political in this, so I don't know if, in fact, it will be reality one day. And the third point is, do you think that the rights of nature are compatible with the idea of sustainable development? Because I have discussed about it a lot with some friends and colleagues. Or do you think, would it be like a post-development doctrine, such as the Grow by Serge Latouche, for example? Another point, do you think would harmony with nature be a doctrine? I've heard about it in Brazil. Do you think it will be a doctrine of post-humanism? Is it compatible with the human rights? What is the interference? Please let me know what you think about this point. Sorry, Alessandro, but the situation, political situation in Brazil, it's a little sad. So I'm trying to be optimism, but now I don't believe that man is able to abandon the anthropocentric view. I don't think that people are already ready for it, and it's sad because I think it's so necessary. Let me think. Let me know what you think about it, please, if you don't mind.
They excellent questions, Mariana. And before I actually begin, did I manage to speak slowly enough for the points to be clearly understood, or was I going still too fast? I can see.
I believe everything was really calm and tranquil, so don't worry about that, Alessandro.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'll try and maintain the same pace in answering the questions then. So the first one is about the relevance of the concept of Pachamama within the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence. Well, I think there are two things here. Firstly, the concept of the Pachamama was crucial in my presentation simply because it has been historically relevant. It was present at a few key threshold moments. It was present in 2008, it was present in 2010, and it's present in Colombia. It is relevant in those cases that have become the focal points of research. However, as you said correctly, Mariana, it's not the only concept. There are many concepts that are parallel, distinct, albeit similar, throughout the world. And there are quite a few initiatives in Africa already. Nigeria is one of them. Kenya is another, where rights of nature legislation has been construed in accordance with African concepts. One of them being, for example, the idea of Ubuntu, the idea of, they say that there's a saying in Xhosa that is Nubuntu, Nabuntu, Nubuntu, Mubuntu, Nabuntu. A person is a person because of other persons. So it's a statement of interconnectedness. And so the Pachamama was one of the first non-European terms to be used, but now it's not, and thank you for that question, it's far from the only one. I don't want to diminish the value of Pachamama, of course, but I want to emphasize the plurality within which we exist. The idea in Australia, for example, there's the idea of begar in Gumbangir, the meat which you cannot eat. So the sense of distinction and ecological and normative responsibility that some humans have towards some elements of nature. So these concepts definitely exist in the movement. They're not, as soon as you move away from Latin America, they are very present. And they may seem to be more central in Latin America simply because they are central in Latin America. But if we actually expand and look at the planet from the outside, we can see many ideas coexisting at the same time. In Sweden, they're talking about the idea of Lodin, and Lodin is mythologically the mother of, and sorry, Anna, I know that I keep pronouncing it incorrectly, but she is mythologically the mother of Thor, the Mother Earth itself. And so they try to use pre-existing cosmological views to articulate rights of nature. So that's the first one, the first point. The second point is about the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Nature. There already is a Universal Declaration of the Rights of Nature. That's the one that came out of Bolivia in 2010. And that was proposed to the United Nations by the Bolivian delegation not long thereafter. And that is what formed the basis for the Harmony with Nature program. It's what sparked the Harmony with Nature program. So a Universal Declaration already exists. The question that you ask, however, is what is the significance? Well, this is just a theoretical document at the moment. It's one that comes from the global civil movement, but it hasn't been enshrined in international legislation yet. The question that you're asking, however, is more deep. Is what is the role of an international community against the current emergence or re-emergence of strong nationalist movements? It appears to me that nationalist movements today, in this age, are more of a hindrance and an obstacle than a help. We can see that, I think, very clearly right now. The individual national response to the pandemic crisis is a hindrance to the capacity to address the crisis timely and collectively. If the countries that have been more successful in dealing with the pandemic, in stopping the pandemic, have had one particular approach. That approach might be completely undermined by countries that haven't. So we all see the tragedy that the US are today. We can see numbers rising in quantities that are unbelievable. So a single nation state is capable of undoing that which many other nation states are doing. So in other words, nationalism today is very much clear with the state of the world right now, seems to be a hindrance, not help. So I'm very much an internationalist by instinct. I do believe that we form part of an a collective international, intellectual and normative community. So I'm very much an advocate for transcending the boundaries of nation states today, very much like Yanis Varoufakis argues in his books. But whether that is in real political terms, whether that is possible, then obviously that's another question. That is the ultimate goal that I would advocate as necessary today. Whether that can be achieved, that's another question, which leads me to point 5, which I get to in a second. The third point was whether rights of nature are compatible with sustainable development. And I imagine that when we speak of sustainable development, we refer to the Brundtland definition. So the development that meets the needs of today without impairing the needs of the future generations. And we know that sustainability has been, the overshoot of our lifestyle has already occurred in the late or mid 1990s, according to the limits to growth modeling. So I think actually that rights of nature can be articulated both as a sustainable development discourse or as a post-sustainability discourse. Ecological economics can come into it. And that leads to the fourth point, the one about rights of nature and human rights, and the balancing of those rights. Some fear that rights of nature might simply and automatically impair human rights. However, the question, and Cormac articulated that very clearly for me once. He said the question is balancing those rights. So say that you want to build a road that would cut a tree down. If you're building, that you have a tree in your backyard and you want to cut it down because the risk is for the tree to fall onto your home, then of course that tree should be cut down. The rights of the inhabitant of that dwelling and the risk that they run probably trumps the right of the tree to survive. However, if you just want to cut down the tree because you want to have a better view, maybe the right of the tree should take preeminence. So it's an issue of balancing rights, and the rights. I would say that rights of nature is just one portion of the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence. It's not the only one. And what it does, it asks the courts to make a determination on that balancing of the exercise in balancing rights. So rights of nature as a way of shifting the responsibility to determine what our collective rights and responsibilities are onto dedicated courts. And then Arthur Benjamin, the last year in New York, actually said, this is an unprecedented terrain for many judges who are still struggling with ideas of environmental law and now have to deal with more deep ideas of ecological jurisprudence. And that leads me to the last question of pessimism and optimism. And I have to say that I'm generally an optimist by nature. And so I tend to try and look for the positive in everything that I see. At the moment, as you were saying, I'm doing extensive research for the book that I'm writing. And so my optimism is somewhat challenged by what I read. And sometimes I despair and think that it's not, it may not be possible to achieve that which an ecological jurisprudence promises. However, I don't think it's an issue of optimism or pessimism. I think it's an issue of strategy. What is the best strategy that we have, given the current conditions we are faced with, if we are to act in a precautionary manner? If we have to take the precautionary principle seriously, and if we are to act in a way that is capable of guaranteeing the highest success of survival, not as a species, but as at least as a civilization, then we absolutely ought to act in a way that is consistent with principles that are aligned to what we observe to be the evolutionary case for survivability of legal system, not just of individual organisms or species. And so that's why an ecological jurisprudence is an evolutionary adaptation, or an adaptation of evolutionary theory to the study of legal systems. And so it makes sense that we adopt a suite of tools to try and somewhat limit the excessive consumptions that we seem to be doing today collectively. I hope I somehow answered most of these points. Obviously, we could go on forever talking about these points, but I hope actually I answered some of them.
Okay, thank you, Alessandro. You helped me a lot. Now let's talk to Professor Jonathan. Jonathan, do you have any questions to Professor Alessandro?
Yes, innanzitutto chiaramente vorrei ringraziare il professore Alessandro perché sì, alla fine, insomma, sono anche io italo-brasiliano, per cui lo so le difficoltà, diciamo, di parlare anche in inglese, perché sì, lo sappiamo che tutti vogliamo muovere le mani, le braccia, insomma, vogliamo essere sempre liberi. Comunque parlerò in inglese perché abbiamo un'udienza che, insomma, presenta questo discorso, questo argomento deve essere fatto in inglese. And now in English, I was just saluting Professor Alessandro, and this, I think it's a really, really interesting opportunity. And firstly, I would like to state some facts about our university and what we are doing to the environment, and then I'll give some pointers to what I think it's interesting. We are really, really, really connected to the social, to the society, sorry. And in that case, we have many, many examples of trying to build up a good relation with nature. For example, we're trying to reduce waste in our program, the postgraduate program on law. We are going paperless right now, and these are many of the examples inside our program. In any case, the university now is also going green, which means they are investing over $7 million into converting all the electric grid into photovoltaic panels. And in that case will be 3 big farms, one with 1.8 megawatts, another one with 1.45, and then another one just with 6 kilowatts, only to do experimental work. So one is for the university, another one is for the hospital, and the third one is only for research. And I think this tries to demonstrate what we are trying to do to the environment there in Unimar. So we have micromanagement problems, and then we have the macro problems we're trying to solve by ourselves. And this is one of the contributions we are giving to the environment. And also we try to give free milk and also try to tend to our animals. So the university also is a really, really huge farm. Then I think Mariana can send to everyone all the plans of the university and where it's located and all the green areas that we have. We have a lake, we have fish, we have cows, we have even trained dogs and all of that. So yeah, I think it's interesting to present the university to the audience because we have people from the UN, and that's why we are enrolled in this program, the Harmony of Nature, by the means of Professor Mariana. Obviously, I have some different premises, and one of them is really closely connected to my view of the law. So I'm really not free for all law or even a free law or something like that. I'm really connected to the legal positivism. And in that case, obviously, I believe in that. I believe that hard law is important. And then I'll refer back to the difference between common law and civil law. But in any case, obviously, we have to bear in mind that we have to be intertextual and interdisciplinary. Because to tend to nature is not only looking at nature from a biological standpoint. I believe also this is the problem right now into how we have to face the pandemic, because some people are just looking from one side and not looking from every side possible. Because obviously the epidemiologists, they want to close everyone down until it comes to a point that we have the vaccine or a cure to the pandemic, but this is not feasible. So we have to address this in a different number of ways. Nature is roughly the same. We have to work with economics, we have to work with biology, we have to work with labor law, we have to work with many different aspects, because obviously people exist. People are going to consume, but how this will be good for the environment, how it will be sustainable. And this is really interesting when we talk about, for example, what Alessandro said before about ecological jurisprudence and also ecological governance. And I believe this is a good point to start, not only closing ourselves down and saying, yeah, we want to protect nature at any cost, but this will not come to an end because, as I said, we have people and people are consuming. So how can we tend to that? This is one of the points that I was trying to make. And also, we have somewhat of a realpolitik related to that. So we have to have countries that have some economic backgrounds, and this is open to the Forum of United Nations. So one country has, for example, their interests in oil or coal or fracking or anything that we can learn of. And then we have to go to the realpolitik and say, okay, which is the least worst option? And sometimes I think the dialogue is carried over through a lens that only the protection of the environment is the only way. But we have the reality.
Catarina, você tá aí?
I think someone entered with the microphone. Okay. Yeah, I think everyone is hearing me right now. And obviously, we have some common grounds that we have we have to bear in mind some backgrounds, a common background. That's why we have, for example, the doctrine of transconstitutionalism in Brazil, made by Marcelo Neves, which is really interesting. And we have to connect all the legal orders, the international level, the nation level, the central state level, the regional governments, and also the cities. And here in Brazil, obviously, this is really, really complicated, because when we want to do some kind of regulations, we look at the international level, and then we have to say, is this going to be effective since there are so many layers of government? And I think I want to hear Alessandro more on this difficulties and these problems that affects all of them, all of us. I know in Italy we have 3 levels of government. I know in Brazil we have, but they are more closely connected to the American way. But how are we going to deal with that? And to finish my small intervention, obviously I want to hear more about the experience of being from a common law, civil law background, and then going to the common law, and how it affected your studies, because it's really interesting, because there is a paradox. Because normally we say, okay, common law is only jurisprudence. However, when we talk about regulatory law, the regulations are way, way, way more developed than in civil law countries. For example, I'll give a tax law example because it's my background. Here, the revenue code is only, the income tax code is what, 1,000 articles or something like that. And when we look at the American one, are 500 or 600 pages of regulation. And we try to dismiss and say, no, common law countries are only jurisprudence, but this is really not the case. And this obviously affects the way that we deal with nature in precisely the ecological jurisprudence. So I think I made my point across, and I hope everyone understood me. And I think Alessandro will answer that with the brilliance that he did on the lecture.
Well, first of all, obrigado, Jonathan. That was a fantastic greeting and brilliant questions themselves. So really well articulated, very, very interesting. So thank you for that. So let me start with congratulating as many of the chats, the comments actually did, the university for doing that, which is doing. That's fantastic. I think also that speaks to the spectrum, the ontological intellectual spectrum that is encompassed by the emergence of an ecological jurisprudence. At one end of the spectrum, that can be actions such as this one, such as the technological responses to an existing crisis, like such as the ones that you've described. And I think in that sense, legal positivism is an absolutely perfect and brilliant way to engage with such responses. There's no need to question the jurisprudential theoretical foundation. I use jurisprudence in the sense of legal theory, not of legal decisions, not jurisprudencia, but legal theory, the theory of law. So, but then at the other end of the spectrum, what ecological jurisprudence does, it allows us to question the very foundations of what law is. Is law, in other words, an exclusively human normative enterprise? Is it something that, is it the Augustinian idea of the command of the sovereign backed by the threat of sanction, or the Clausenian idea of the norm? Or is it an emerging property of relationships? So in other words, it allows us to explore the idea of normativity beyond the divide between natural law and legal positivism that has been traditionally construed. And of course, I completely agree with you, Jonathan. That is not a discussion that any politician will ever do. It's not. First of all, they don't have the time. They might not have the inclination, but even if they did have the inclination, they might not have the time to do it. And so in this sense, we are privileged because it is our responsibility as academics, as the the public intellectuals that we are to undertake and explore this discussion. So we are somewhat privileged in that we can stretch the boundaries of the possible here. And that also speaks to Mariana's point of optimism and pessimism. We can stretch the boundaries of the possible beyond realpolitik. It is not our responsibility to find the solution, but just look at the possibilities of what the solutions can be. Whether they actually are taken, whether they are taken in our lifetime, that is beyond our purview. But we can still explore these possibilities. And so in that sense, of course, in real political terms, we do have major problems on a daily basis. And that is an issue of politics. But from a legal theoretical perspective, we can set that aside for a little while and really engage with the theory without having to concern ourselves with those politics. When we return to them, then we'll have a clearer idea with which to engage with them. And as you said, this exploration inevitably and inherently leads to interdisciplinarity. I hope I showed that my particular work engages with anthropology and anthropological interdisciplinarity quite extensively. And I use, for example, at the moment, a lot of Viveiro de Castro work. So there's a lot of work that is coming out of Brazil, for example, right now in that. But of course, that morphs into comparative constitutionalism, ecological economics, and so on and so forth. The second last thing is about the layers of government. Australia is very similar to Brazil. And so Italy has 3 levels, but not really. It only has 1 level of government, effectively. It's a central government, whereas Australia, like Brazil, is a federal government. And it's an extremely costly, unlike Brazil, Australia only has 20 million people. So for the population of Australia, it's an extremely non-cost effective way of running the country. It's an historical legacy that has perpetrated itself, but it's extremely costly because things are doubled up. But the problem is the same, because any international agreement is not automatically ratified in Australia, but it has to be legislated by the federal government. I don't know whether in Brazil it's the same or whether it's
the same in Brazil. We have to ratify it, and
then legislate it as well. Yes.
In some extent, yeah. Because the president just only has to decree that we have ratified and this tax goes into effect when the president issues the decree. But obviously, this affects everyone in Brazil. However, when we go back to a regulatory standpoint, for example, even though we have the international level, then when we go to regulate this tax inside Brazil, we have the 3 layers of legislation. So the federal, the state or regional one, and the municipal one. And they all may clash. They all may have different perspectives on how to regulate the problem that was legislated on an international level.
Similarly here in Australia, we only have 2 levels in Australia. So there's the federal and the state level. There are no municipal levels, so that's just delegated legislation here. But similarly, not only an international treaty has to be ratified, but it has to be fully legislated by the federal parliament. So it's not even just a decree, but it has to be a full legislation, a full act of parliament that comes out of it, that effectively copies the treaty, but it's an internal document. So these are 2 very clear examples of how there's a clash between realpolitik and the tendency or the trends to transnationalization of the problems that we are faced with today. Because the issue, climate change is a very good example. The climatic changes do not occur in a specific region. They are caused everywhere. And any kind of pollution. When the Australian wildfires occurred at the end of 2019, I remember I was quite shocked to see that particles were visible in Buenos Aires on one day. So the forests that were burned here were bigger than the ones that burned in Brazil 3 months prior. and the entirety, effectively an area twice the size of Belgium, was burned over 3 months here in Australia. The effects were felt in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. So obviously we have transnational problems that we are trying to solve with national protectionism. And that is a clash, of course. Whether that can be solved with we're not Thanos. We don't have the magic gauntlet that, we just clip our fingers and do it. But there is clearly a tension. And that leads to the very practical nature of this tension, which is the question with which you conclude, the tension between common law and civil law. And as a civil lawyer, I completely agree with you. The common law is a mess. It's impossible to understand it. Company law comprises effectively something around 350 to 400 articles in the Italian Civil Code, roughly. The Company Law Act is comprised of 2,000 pages here in Australia. Similarly, no one can read it. No one has any idea of what the little details are. And so it's funny because often I speak to my colleagues and they seem to act more by instinct than by logic. The reaction or engagement with the law. So obviously I'm being a little bit facetious now and sarcastic, but there's a way of engaging with law that is absolutely alien to us trained in civil law. We train to think structurally and linearly. We think of what is the bigger structure, what is the main principle, and then we derive consequently derive the factual decisions from those principles, and in a very, very logical manner. That is not the case, I feel, in common law. And there's a tension, there's an internal tension between this narrative of if you want to, social emergence of law being inscribed in the historical tradition of the society from which it emerged, and a hyper-regulatory approach, whereby when regulation occurs, it doesn't occur a single time in a cohesive and scalar manner. There's rarely the idea of a single code that covers the entirety of the matter, but there's a plethora of acts of infinite length that then deals with absolute details, sometimes excruciating details with specific manners. So I have to say it was a little bit of a challenge to engage with the law, with common law at first. Thankfully, my background is as a comparative lawyer and a legal anthropologist. So I've always been interested in the way in which legal systems are structured. And in particular, the way in which the normative structure of the legal system interplays with what Sacco calls the legal formants, the non-legal elements that underpin a legal system. So or what Van Herke calls the deep legal comparison. The principles of philosophy, politics, ethics, etc., that seem to underpin a legal order. And so it was more interesting than challenging to engage with the common law from that point of view. And it allows me to see things that may not be apparent to someone trained in a single jurisdiction. So, for example, the idea of personhood that I was describing before is self-evident to us. And I say us as civil lawyers. The idea that there are these two categories, natural persons and artificial persons, is intuitively known by all of us. Not so in common law. To them, there is not such an idea of the person as clearly identified as in the civil law tradition. So to be inhabiting this liminal space is quite a privilege because it allows me to see things that I wouldn't otherwise see. Were I to be a practicing lawyer in Australia, that would be hell. But I'm not. Thankfully, I am not. So I'm not. I found that interesting rather than daunting. But I can see. I completely agree with you. From a civil lawyer to try and engage with the common law is a challenge. So I hope actually I engaged. They were really fantastic points of discussions that you raised and very relevant ones.
Thank you, Alessandro.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Alessandro. Our time is completely over. It's very sad, but I will have to end it. So my last words to Alessandro, I want to say thank you. Thank you for your lecture. Thank you for being who you are. You are brilliant. I'm sure that your presence here today will enlighten many young students to continue fighting for environment, and it's fantastic. I think we can use the university in this fight, because that's the word, it's fight. And I think this is our duty as professors. So today I feel that I made my function as professor for your being here and speaking to my students. Thanks a lot. I hope to see you again in this university, maybe in presence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariana, for your beautiful words, and absolutely likewise, the admiration and respect and inspiration are absolutely reciprocal. And it's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been a pleasure to meet you, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure to meet everyone. And I as you said, I think not just the professors, but universities in the original sense. The term university comes from the Latin Universitas Scholarum et Studentorum, the collective, the universal collective of all the students and the scholars. And so the pursuit of intellectual rigor is something that we do collectively as in a dialogue. So those who have a little bit more experience and those who are embarking in that journey for the first time, or that particular disciplinary journey for the first time. And so I really thank you, Mariana, for your inspiration ongoing and your commitment to not giving up, notwithstanding the pessimism that you said actually that sometimes besieges you. And but I also thank everyone for being here, because it is I saw there were some beautiful comments there, and thank you for being here, because it is thanks to us that we can have these ongoing conversations, and that we maintain the meaning of the universitas. So thank you.
I wish we could have some time more, but the time is completely over.
And also we would like to welcome you in our university. Obviously, it's only 20 hours of flight or something like that. But in any case, I think it will be really interesting when you come over, that we can at least have some interaction in a physical way.
I look forward. I really look forward to it.
It would be fantastic.
Grazie
Thank you
mille.
again. Now,
Grazie a voi. Obrigado.
De nada. I will stop the record.